Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Evan Verplu, and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council here in Kansas City. The IRC is an education-based nonprofit, and we center crucial skills like empathy, media literacy, and active listening to bridge differences of opinion and promote informed civil discourse around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. We hold the mission of increasing our global acumen and encouraging civic responsibility. We're so pleased to partner with the wonderful presenting organizations this year of the 2024 China Town Hall. We have the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, the United States Heartland China Association, the KU Center for East Asian Studies alongside us here at the IRC, who are presenting this year's local China Town Hall. The Chinatown Hall very much exemplifies what we hold dear at the IRC, which is thought-provoking dialogue about issues that impact each and every one of us. We do hope you'll visit us at our website, irckc.org, to learn more about the International Relations Council, including information about membership, our upcoming events, and the long history of us as a Kansas City organization. Also encourage you to visit the websites of the other presenting partners of today's program, because each and every one of them do a ton of work to promote a really strong dialogue around these issues. So I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to Dr. Jack Zhang, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas. He received his PhD from the Department of Political Science at UC San Diego. His dissertation examines when and why economically interdependent countries use military versus economic coercion in foreign policy disputes. In 2018-2019, he was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governments at Princeton University. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Evan, and such a pleasure to cooperate with the IRC, and this year for the first time, the U.S. Heartland China Association on our Chinatown Hall. We also have a twofer this year. This is the second Town Hall we're doing this academic year. I think in future, this event's going to be pushed to this spring time slot. But let me begin by saying a few things about the Center for East Asian Studies, and then to introduce our speaker for today. So the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Kansas is a major academic hub and premier resource for East Asian studies on the Great Plains region. It's composed of 60 plus faculty members across 25 departments. And again, really, happy for this partnership to work with the IRC to bring you this year's Chinatown Hall yet again. We are delighted to have a fantastic speaker as our local speaker this year. Dr. Ketian Zhang is an assistant professor of International Security in the Scar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia. She is one of the emerging experts on Chinese foreign policy and economic statecraft, and sort of China's use of coercion. And I've been a big fan of her work for a really long time, and was delighted to have her acquire a copy of her recent newly off the press book from Cambridge University Press, China's Gambit, The Calculus of Coercion, which is what Dr. Zhang will be presenting to us today. Ketian received her PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she is a proud Wisconsin Badger from her bachelor's days. And also, I admire and sympathize, commensurate with Ketian, because she's also a mother of a young child, and I don't know how she finds all the time to do the excellent research that she does. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Zhang. This session is being recorded, will be posted on the YouTube page of the Center for East Asian Studies later. And I would encourage audience members to please, as you have questions that come up, please use the Q&A feature to ask them. I will try to curate them and read them and pose it to Dr. Zhang following her book talk. All right, without further ado, over to you, Ketian.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Jack Zhang, for the kind introduction. To answer your very nice question, my husband is a preschool teacher, so I outsource all of my motherly duties to my husband. So Thanks so much again for having me here. So let me share my slides, and hopefully all of you can see my slides all right. So I'll start my timer. So today I'm going to be presenting my book titled China's Gambits, The Calculus of Coercion. So let's begin by taking a look at a data set of China's coercion that I collected from 1990 to 2020. So the gray bars that you see here are coded as coercion. And by coercion, I mean the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. So we can see that over the past 3 decades, the frequency of China's coercion has been on the rise, which is not surprising given how much power China has grown over the years. But what's more interesting to me is that when we look at the tools of China's coercion, there's actually a variation. So same figure, but broken down into different kinds of coercive tools. The blue bars here are cases of military coercion, and orange bars cases of non-military coercion. So we can see that in the 1990s, China used military coercion about half of the time. An example would be the missile testing over the Taiwan Strait, because Taiwan is considered one of the core interests of China. And beginning 2000s, we're seeing an increase of China's coercion overall. But interestingly, China has been overwhelmingly utilizing non-militarized coercive tools in lieu of military coercion. An example is the banana ban that China imposed against Filipino banana exports to China over maritime disputes in the South China Sea in 2012, an example of economic sanctions. And another example is the use of gray zone coercion. So in this picture, you're seeing the Chinese maritime surveillance ships, the predecessor to the Chinese Coast Guard ships, ramming a Vietnamese vessel also over disputes in the South China Sea. And this is a form of gray zone coercion. So there's variation over the tools of China's coercion. And in addition, another aspect of China's coercion that also puzzles me as a scholar is the targets of China's coercion. So as you'll see, we're going to talk about the South China Sea a lot today. So let's stick with this South China Sea theme and take a look at an internal map that I got from the Chinese Academy of Sciences when I was doing field work a couple years back. And the whitish area, as you can see in the middle, is the South China Sea. And China has maritime territorial disputes and sovereignty disputes in the South China Sea with several Southeast Asian countries. So the black dashed line that you see here is what's called China's 9-dash line. So China essentially claims all of the land features as well as maritime rights from within the 9-dash line. And towards your bottom, you're going to see some orange dots, and these are Malaysian oil fields. And there are a lot of them from within the 9-dash line. And to your right, you're going to see one single purple dot, and that's the Philippine oil field. And there's only one within the 9-dash line. Now, what I want you to do, if it's possible, is for you to enter into the chat function here on Zoom about this question of these two countries, Malaysia and the Philippines, which of them would China be coercing more harshly and frequently? So I would love to hear or just see answers in the chat function about whether you vouch for Malaysia or the Philippines. So I'll just stop for 20 seconds, maybe, for some of you who might be entering your answers, Team Malaysia or Team Philippines.
We have one guess on the Philippines.
Yay.
My guess as well. But.
Well, it seems that there are a lot of answers. So I'm just gonna not look at them, and I'll show you the results. So let me preface by saying that I was Team Malaysia when I was looking at this map initially because of how many oil fields Malaysia has within the 9-dash line. But I was wrong, unfortunately. So for those of you who entered the Philippines, you actually won. China coerced the Philippines a lot more harshly and frequently than it does with regard to Malaysia. So I was wrong. And this variation over the tools and targets of China's coercion led me to answer this, or try to answer this central question of this book, which is when, why, and how does China coerce when faced with perceived threats to its national security? So in the book, I offer the cost balancing theory to examine China's coercion and placing coercion in an era of global economic interdependence and argue for 3 things. And first, I argue that China coerces one target state in order to deter other states from doing similar things that it does not like in the future. And second, I argue that coercion is more likely when the need to establish a reputation for resolve is high, but the economic cost of coercing the target state is low. And by the need to establish a reputation for resolve, I mean concerns about appearing weak or showing weakness to the other states if no coercive action is used. And finally, I would argue that China prefers to use non-militarized coercive tools when the geopolitical cost is high. In other words, China is concerned about the dispute escalating into a militarized confrontation if military coercion is used. And this oftentimes leads China to adopt Goldilocks choices, that is, using coercion, but for fear of escalation, it kept it at the non-militarized level. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to first talk about or define what I mean by coercion a little bit more in detail and explain the theory a little bit more comprehensively as well, and then talk about mostly the sources that I use for the book. So I'll skip over the research design, so I promise no, jargons, and then use several empirical cases in the South China Sea to illustrate the arguments in the book, and finally conclude and talk about the policy implications. So in line with the literature, I define coercion as the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. In particular, I'm looking at actions in the literature which is referred to as compellence, that is to compel or to force the other state to do things that they otherwise would not have wanted to do. So there's a full spectrum of coercive tools that states, including China, can utilize. And the first kind could be diplomatic sanctions. An example of that would be canceling senior level meetings between China and the target state, or more extremely, embassy closure or cutting ties completely. And the second kind of tool that states can impose or utilize would be economic sanctions. And the banana ban that we just saw in the beginning would be an example, but more extremely, states can adopt embargoes as well. So what straddles these strictly non-military and military coercion is what I call gray zone coercion. So it is the use or threats of civilian law enforcement organizations to inflict potential physical damage on the target state. And China's use of its maritime surveillance ships or the Coast Guard ships to ram into the foreign vessels in the South China Sea would be an example. And finally, states can escalate to military coercion. So China's missile testing and military exercises off of the Taiwan Strait would be an example. Now that we've talked about the concept, let's get to the theory a little bit more in detail. So the underlying assumption of the book, as well as a lot of my research, is that in an era of global economic interdependence, coercion decisions are a result of balancing security and economic factors. And the book answers two questions. First, when and why China coerces, and second, what tools it's more or less likely to utilize when it does decide to coerce. So let's get to the one question first. So here I argue that because states balance between external security as well as economic concerns, so on the one hand, they might want to use coercion in order to demonstrate to the other states that it is committed and strong and resolved to defend its national security interests. And states might fear that if no coercive action or threat is used, then other states might view inaction of the state, coercing state, as unresolved and weak. So this might push states to use coercion or to choose coercion. But on the other hand, coercion does carry with it costs. And I would argue that the primary cost is economic. Because, for example, China is an economically integrated state and is part of the global production and supply chains, then it has to take into consideration the potential negative economic consequences of using coercion. For example, the target state might retaliate economically or through other means, and trade between China and other states might be interrupted if coercion is used. And therefore, that's why there is this cost balancing logic in terms of China's coercion decisions. And I argue first that China will need to decide the level of the need to establish resolve. And if the need is low, we're more likely to see China refraining from coercion. But when the need to establish resolve is high, China will then need to consider the economic cost of coercing the target state. So when the economic cost is low, we're more likely to see China using coercion. Now, you might be wondering, what about the circumstances when the need to establish resolve and economic costs are both high? How does China decide? So I would argue that in these circumstances, the issue importance variable comes into play. So by issue importance, I mean the states attached to certain issues. For example, in the case of China, empirically, there's a strictly defined interest hierarchy, with Taiwan and Tibet being the core interests. And other issues such as maritime disputes, the things that we're going to be talking about today, they're important, but they're not at the level of core interests. So I argue it's only when the issue is about the core interest that we're more likely to see China using coercion. And when the issue importance is lower, we're more likely to see China refraining from coercion when the need to establish resolve and economic costs are both high. So in the book, especially the chapter on Taiwan, I talked a lot about issue importance, but for today, we're going to be zooming in on cases where the need to establish resolve and economic cost are not both high. Now, let's turn to the second part of the question, which is about the tools of China's coercion. So here, I argue that geopolitical backlash cost explains when China uses non-militarized coercive tools. And the logic here is that because China is concerned about the potential that other states might balance against itself by forming alliances or strengthening alliances with other states, especially great powers such as the United States, then when the geopolitical cost is high, we're more likely to see China using non-militarized coercion because China fears that the use of military coercion might draw in external great powers with whom the target state has mutual defense treaties with, for example, the United States. And that might escalate the dispute into a militarized confrontation, which China does not like. So as a result, it's only when the geopolitical backlash cost is lower that we're more likely to see China using military coercion. And that, I would say, applies a lot of to the Sino-Indian land border dispute cases. So this ends the discussion of the theory itself. Let's now take a look at some of the sources that I utilize, for the book. Well, here we go. What you're seeing here is a pile of books about 30 pounds that I hauled from China after a trip to China in spring 2023. On top of it is a red steady notebook for the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress. And of course, Ketian didn't use any of these books for the book on coercion per se. I'm using these for some of my more recent research, but I do utilize primary Chinese language sources of several kinds. So let me give you some examples here. And the first example would be official sources, basically from the Chinese government. So on the left-hand side, for example, is a book titled China's Foreign Affairs, published by the Chinese Foreign Ministry annually going all the way back to 1987. And on the right-hand side would be a secret document from the Central International Liaison Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And I did not steal this document from China. It's actually available at the Gambit Library at George Washington University, which has a lot of wonderful resources on China. And the second kind of source I utilize would be semi-official sources, for example, documents and reports from Chinese government think tanks. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing an internal report from the Chinese National Institute for South China Sea Studies. And on the right-hand side would be some internal analysis from the Chinese Navy that I gained access to when I was doing field work a couple years back prior to the pandemic in China. And finally, I was able to cross-check the aforementioned sources with interviews I've done over the years. So I've done about 152 interviews, and 45% of them were with Chinese government analysts, and about a quarter were with former diplomats and officials, and 6% were with former military officials, and 25% were with well-connected Chinese scholars who sometimes brief central leaders, including Xi Jinping. So these interviews are useful because they provide a specific knowledge about the case that I'm interested in, but I also use them to cross-check against other sources so that I'm not biased towards one source over another. So this concludes my discussion of the sources. Now let's turn to hopefully what's more interesting, that is the empirics in the book. Like I said earlier, we're going to be focusing on the South China Sea. So let's take a look at Figure 2, which tracks data about the South China Sea, specifically challenges from other disputes in the South China Sea from 1990 to 2020. And the blue bars here are coded as incidents, by which I mean actions taken by other disputes in the South China Sea. And it's important to note that these incidents are not necessarily actions that tilt the military balance of power in the South China Sea to China's disadvantage, And oftentimes, these are actions that are designed to strengthen the administrative control and claims of the other disputants in the South China Sea, for example, Malaysia, among other states. And China views these actions, however minor they are, as diminishing China's own sovereignty claims and administrative control over the rocks in the South China Sea. So let me give you some concrete examples. In the 1990s, you're seeing this little bump here, and they tend to include examples such as Vietnam occupying a new land feature in the South China Sea. And in between 2000 and 2005 or so, you're seeing a slight decrease. And these tend to include examples that are way more demure and much less dramatic than compared to the actions in the 1990s. And one example is a Malaysian politician landing on a land feature that it has already occupied since the 1990s. And beginning 2007, you're seeing a slight increase again in terms of these incidents. And these tend to include actions such as, for example, the Philippines signing an oil and gas contract with a foreign company in the South China Sea. So this is the same figure, but I added China's coercion in response to some of these incidents in red. And we can see that in the 1990s, China used coercion from time to time, although I do want to emphasize that China actually doesn't use coercion every time there is an incident that China considers as threatening to its sovereignty, right? So China is very cautious and selective in terms of when to use coercion. And some of the cases of China's coercion in the 1990s were actually militarized. And in between 2000 and 2006 or so, China refrained from coercion. And beginning 2007, we're seeing China using coercion again, and again selectively, not responding to every single incident. And none of the post-2007 cases of China's coercion were militarized. So in the book, I looked at the temporal trends of China's patterns of coercion and demonstrate that the temporal trends is in line with the temporal changes of the variables that we talked about earlier. But for the talk, just for illustration purposes, let me introduce two cases. And the first one is the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident between China and the Philippines, where China used coercion. And interestingly, the exact same incident took place in 2001, also again over the Scarborough Shoal, where the only difference is that China refrained from coercion in that case. So let's take a look at 2012 to see why China used coercion in this case. So as you can see, the Scarborough Shoal is this little red dot in the South China Sea, and that China and the Philippines both claim to be its own territory. And in April 2012, Chinese fishermen tried to fish in this disputed waters, and they were arrested by the Filipino Navy vessel. And China used several kinds of coercive tools in response. And the first one is that China used its maritime surveillance ships, again, the predecessor to the Chinese Coast Guard ship, to blockade Philippine Navy vessels from entry into the Scarborough Shoal, such that they came to a standoff. And secondly, China imposed the banana ban that we discussed earlier, a form of economic sanctions. And finally, China also imposed diplomatic sanctions by not meeting with senior Filipino counterparts for at least 6 months. And it's important to know that these three forms of coercive tools were all non-militarized. So the goals of China's coercion in this case were twofold, with the direct goal being forcing the Philippines to withdraw, but the broader goal in terms of forcing a restraint on all South China Sea disputes. So my argument is that the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but the economic cost of coercing the Philippines was low. So let's take a look at why I argue that the need to establish resolve vis-a-vis the Philippines was high in this case. So there are several pieces of evidence to suggest that, and first is that prior to China using coercion in 2012, there was an increased number of actions taken by the Philippines and other South China Sea disputants, the little blue bars that you see earlier. And these actions themselves were heavily reported through international media exposure. So the logic to China's concern here is that there were more actions, increase of them, that China considers as threatening to China's sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, and these incidents were heavily reported internationally. So China fears that if no coercive action is taken, then other states are all observing these incidents as well as watching China's response or lack thereof. And if China does not use coercion, then other states might interpret this inaction as unresolved and weak and might take further actions in the future. And this applies to the Scarborough Shoal incident itself. So let's take a look at a photo. Up front, you'll see some Chinese fishermen, and the gentleman in the back was the Philippine Navy personnel. And this photo was taken by the Philippine Navy and was released to the AFP prior to China using coercion, adding to China's pressure to establish resolve because of the media exposure. So I also look at primary Chinese language sources to indicate that the logic of establishing resolve indeed was crucial to China's use of coercion in this 2012 case. So this is one source from Zhongsheng at People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party papers, Communist Party's official party paper in February 2012 that noted that if the Philippines viewed China's push for cooperation as a sign of weakness, the Philippines had the wrong calculus. So here China was concerned about being viewed as weak by especially the Philippines. And similarly, the same source noted again during China's coercion that the Philippines should not view China as weak, and China could create a Scarborough model to stop the opponent and deter future transgressions. So here, the logic of using coercion to establish resolve to deter future actions is pretty clear. And also, these two pieces of sources took place before and during China's coercion, so it's not post-hoc justification of China's behavior. And finally, I was able to utilize interviews with former senior Chinese officials, and the consensus among them was that, and they used this ancient Chinese proverb to describe their logic, which is China feared being viewed as weak and wanted to kill the chicken in order to scare the monkeys. So here the Philippines was the chicken and other South China Sea spoons were the monkeys. But I think it's better framed as to scare the chicken in order to scare other monkeys. But please don't ask me the relationship between the chickens and the monkeys in the Q&A. I don't know why they're related. It's just ancient Chinese wisdom that draws a lot of analogies from the zoo. So the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but in contrast, the economic cost for China to coerce the Philippines was low. So figure 3 here tracks Sino-Philippine trade as a total share of Chinese foreign trade from 1993 to 2014. The blue line is percent of China's exports, red line imports. So we can see that if you look at the y-axis, Sino-Philippine trade constituted as a very small amount of overall Chinese foreign trade, at best about 2.5%, more recently is usually less than 1%. And in contrast, and Chinese officials knew well before coercion that Sino-Philippine trade was highly asymmetrical to China's advantage. So by 2012, Sino-Philippine trade constituted about 30% of overall Philippine trade, but only 0.9% for China. And as a result, Chinese officials decided that it was in China's advantage to impose sanctions on the Philippines. Now, let's move on to the second part of the question, which is about why China did not use militarized coercion in this case. All of China's coercive tools were non-militarized. And I argue that that's because of the high geopolitical backlash cost. And I'll skip over some of the temporal pieces of evidence here, but just to summarize by saying that China has been viewing the geopolitical backlash of using military coercion in the South China Sea as high because of, interestingly, U.S. counterterrorism efforts since the early 2000s, which increased U.S. military presence in Southeast Asia that China considers as threatening, and therefore it wants to avoid militarized escalation. And including in this trend or concerns about geopolitical backlash manifests itself also in some of the interviews that I've done with former Chinese officials. One of them mentions that if China used military coercion in 2012, the U.S. Navy might be directly involved. And as a result, we're seeing China adopting the Goldilocks choices, right? That is using coercion, but to avoid escalation, it kept it at the non-militarized level. And interestingly, in contrast, China did not use coercion in 2001, even though Chinese fishermen were arrested by the Filipino Navy vessel at that time as well. And I would argue, and again, very briefly, that the main argument has to do with the low need to establish resolve in 2001, because there weren't as many incidents or actions that China deemed as threatening back in 2001 as compared to 2012, and the level of international media exposure was much lower in 2001 as well. And former deputy Chinese foreign minister also confirmed this logic as well. And finally, before we conclude, let me get to the question of why Team Malaysia lost very briefly, because I think some of you might be on Team Malaysia earlier. So again, the difference between Malaysia and the Philippines is that the need to establish resolve was low regarding Malaysia, but high with regard to the Philippines for several reasons. So first, Chinese interviewees noted that the Philippines is the loudest in internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea, putting China's pressure to establish resolve on the line. Whereas for them, Malaysia is the smart one because it is silently making profits off of the South China Sea without internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea issue. And as a result, China fears that if China does not use coercion against the Philippines, other states might imitate the Philippines' behavior in the future because it's highly salient and highly exposed through the international media. So to briefly conclude, the book examines when, why, and how China coerces, and then argue that China oftentimes adopts Goldilocks choices, that is, balancing between the need to establish resolve and the economic cost of coercing the target state, and thinking also about the geopolitical backlash costs. And this suggests that a globalized economy provides both opportunities and constraints for rising powers' behavior, including China's coercive action. And second, coercion oftentimes is used by China as a signaling device, that is, killing the chicken to scare the monkey, or scaring the chicken to scare the monkey for that matter. And third, the book also adds to the interesting literature that increasingly emphasizes non-traditional forms of coercion, including raison coercion, which travels beyond China to countries such as Iran, Russia, among other states. And finally, I would also like to say that linear power growth is an important variable when it comes to explaining rising power behavior, but is insufficient in explaining rising power behavior. We do need to look at other factors, including economic factors, as well as concerns about resolve. And as for policy implications for the United States, two brief policy implications. And the first one is that I would argue for a quiet rebalancing strategy for the Indo-Pacific. What that means is more actions, less talk. Because oftentimes, without too much media publicity, it'll reduce the China's pressure to establish resolve. So, for example, in the maritime realm, the United States could engage in more frequent and regularized freedom of navigation operations. And second, I would argue that the United States will have more targeted economic leverage by keeping China in the global production and supply chains instead of completely decoupling from China, because that way the United States can keep China continuously vulnerable and dependent on key technologies and products from the United States, which increases the leverage that the United States can have vis-a-vis China. So thank you so much again for having me, and I look forward to the conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ketian. Fantastic presentation. And I'm going to drop some links into the chat here, beginning with a link to Ketian's book. Please order your own copy, leave a good review, and all that. As I mentioned earlier, this discussion is being recorded, and the video will be posted to the Center for East Asian Studies YouTube channel, which I also include a link of. And Ketian is also part of a speaker series that I run at the KU Trade War Lab. So if you like topics like this on economic statecraft, do tune in and join our speaker series. But I'm going to encourage audience members to please use the Q&A feature, enter your questions. We already have a couple that I'm going to begin to weave together into a discussion here for Ketian. So we have a question from Greg here that builds on something that I wanted to ask you about as well, which is putting China's sort of use of economic coercion, or coercion in general, military and economic, in comparative context. How does it differ from coercive behavior of the United States, for example? In what ways does your, I guess, cost balancing theory, to academic terms, right, explain sort of other cases of instrument choice in statecraft?
Right. That is a great question. So I think the question is sort of like a two-pronged, right? Jack asked about a question about more like generalizability. Does it travel beyond China? And Greg asked about sort of comparison in terms of practice between China and the United States. I think to the first question on comparing China and the United States, there might be several differences. And the first one is that I don't have the complete data, but I think the United States, on average, both historically and at the present, might use military coercion a little bit more proportionally than compared to China. And that I think might have to do with the fact that the United States is a hegemon, and there might be a lot of power asymmetry between the United States and the target state the United States is using military coercion on, including, for example, Vietnam. Whereas in the case of China, a lot of the coercive targets that China engages in will tend to include states that are relatively well-developed or OECD countries, for example, Japan, Germany, and France, etc. And again, I think the difference really has to do with economic concerns. And the second difference, in addition to the frequency to use military coercion, is that even in a practice of non-militarized coercive tools, for example, economic sanctions, I have an article that's forthcoming in another journal that compares or contrasts the U.S. sanctions behavior, which tends to be public and formal. U.S. sanctions tend to go through, for example, Congress, and it's announced by the president, et cetera, et cetera. But in contrast, in a data set that I've collected about China's economic sanctions from 1990 to 2023, 87% of Chinese economic sanctions tend to be what's called vague or informal sanctions, including the banana ban, right? So the banana ban that I introduced earlier was announced by the Chinese, I think, Bureau of Quality Inspection and Control, and it was not framed as an economic sanctions episode. Instead, China just said that Philippine bananas, there are pests in the bananas, so we're going to stop them from coming into the Chinese ports, even though the timing of that ban lined up perfectly with the standoff over the Scarborough Shoal. It's very clear that it's using the ban as a form of economic sanctions, but it's never formally or publicly announced. And the argument I would say is that it's partially because of China's concerns about international institutional constraints, for example, WTO rules. Because in those cases, China cannot plausibly argue that its ban is based on essential national security interests. Taiwan might be China's national security interest, essential interest, but those little rocks in the South China Sea certainly do not count as critical or essential national security interest. So because of that, China is fearful of any violation of WTO rules, but it still wants to impose economic sanctions. Therefore, it uses these informal and vague economic sanctions. So I think that's the two major differences that I see between China's coercion and coercion by the United States. And in terms of Jack's question on generalizability, that's a great question. So I don't really have any additional research at the moment in detail that completely matches on to another state's practice of coercion per se. But I would say in these like components of the cost medicine theory, we do see generalizability beyond China. So for example, concerns about geopolitical backlash, I think we could say that Russian use of gray zone activities, not necessarily coercion, but gray zone tactics in general, is sort of like a response or concern about NATO escalation. So I think your colleague, Eric Gartsky, and Andreas Gannon and John Lindsay have a really interesting article, I think, last year that argues that Russia uses gray zone because it's concerned about NATO escalation. So I think there is some similarity there. And as for the need to establish resolve, I think we're seeing even more similarities with both in terms of smaller powers, but also great powers. For example, I think some scholars would argue that the United States engages in war in the Middle East to send a message to allies as well as adversaries around the world that it's strong and committed to defend its interests. So that is sort of like I guess, killing the chicken to scare the monkey kind of dynamic. And others would argue that some of Israel's behavior would also demonstrate this established resolve kind of a dynamic. So I would say there is a level of generalizability, but I haven't really studied the coercion practice of other states in detail.
Really exciting, I think, emerging area of research for the comparative sanctions. And I think I know the background story, in case audience members are curious, behind the killing chickens to scare monkeys things. Is like in ancient China, when they're training monkeys, they're pretty smart. So the idea is you kill a chicken in front of them so that they learn that you're serious. So then they're more behave better to the trainer. At least that's what I have heard about that saying. But to continue the Q&A, I'm gonna ask, I guess, two more questions about the South China Sea, and then we'll talk about domestic politics, and then we'll talk a little bit maybe about research design or research sort of access if we have time. So there's a anonymous question about basically what does China, does China want to dominate the South China Sea, right? Does it want to, and therefore it's targeting loud, competitors and neighbors? What's the end goal there? And then Hank has a question about whether China's island building is a form of coercion in your view. Let's tackle these two.
Sure. Yeah, those are really great questions. I think the audience is very informed, maybe more so than me. So on to the question of I guess China's ultimate goals in the South China Sea. First off, I don't think China's ultimate goal is to, say, dominate the South China Sea per se. In terms of these territorial disputes, what China really wants to gain eventually is to gain sovereignty control over those rocks in the South China Sea, because the South China Sea has a lot of rocks. Maybe I think over 50 of them. China controls about 9 of them in the Spratly Islands and all of the paracels, and other countries, for example, Vietnam actually controls a lot more land features, 29 of them in the South China Sea. So China really wants to regain, I guess, in a way, or ultimately, not as of now, the territory, the land features in the South China Sea, and in addition, the maritime rights, for example, oil and gas drilling rights, among other things in the South China Sea. I don't think it really wants to say gain dominance. And as of now, I don't think the Chinese military has the capability to maintain or gain dominance in the South China Sea either. So if you look at the writings of Chinese government analysts as well as military scholars, they'll say that the PLA Navy as of now has a lot of shortcomings in terms of what they call far sea combat operation capabilities. And the South China Sea is part of China's near seas, but it's at the same time operational wise is really more of like the far sea setting. And the PLA doesn't really have any, I think, capability to dominate the South China Sea. And one of our colleagues, Dr. Fiona Cunningham at UPenn, has a really interesting article in which she argues that in a hypothetical campaign analysis scenario, the United States, with allies' help, for example, South Korea or Japan, could actually impose a blockade against China in the South China Sea. So in a way that shows that, and the Chinese, I think, officials were rational enough to know that it's really impossible for China to dominate the South China Sea at the moment. And I don't think it's also the goal either. And related to the question on island building, that's a perfect segue to another paper, an article that I wrote. So originally the island building part, the land reclamation is part of the dissertation, but I eventually decided to chuck that part out, partially because land reclamation is a different kind of phenomena. Of course, it's not entirely peaceful, but at the same time, it's not the direct kind of coercion in response to an incident that China does not like. So China uses that kind of the 2012 Scarborough Shoal kind of dynamic in order to force stop the behavior of the other states. So island building or land reclamation with the sources that I have is really more for logistical resupply purposes, which again feeds back to my earlier point about the shortcomings of the PLA Navy in the South China Sea. So a lot of the land reclamation are used for economic logistical purposes, but also logistical resupply for the PLA, because the PLA Navy doesn't have other kind of bases in the area, which makes it really difficult for Chinese surface ships to, say, patrol continuously, etc. So land reclamation, I don't think is direct coercion. It's more of a broader deterrence kind of action.
Thank you, Ketian. Now, turning to a question from my colleague, Professor John Kennedy. So your theory has a lot to do with the international factors, right? Shaping China's decision to coerce. Can you talk a little bit about domestic sort of politics, the audience, and maybe nationalism as factors that influence China's decision to coerce? Thank you.
Yeah. Should I take more questions, or do you think we still have time? So I can answer the one by one, right?
Right. I think so. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
sounds great. That's a great question. I did consider nationalism as one potential alternative hypotheses in the book. And of course, I do, and also considered individual leaders. So I guess by domestic, we could probably focus or at least discuss nationalism and the role of individual leaders. So let me get to nationalism first. I think it's an important factor to consider. And I think colleagues like Andrew Chubb, Dr. Andrew Chubb has done a lot on sort of public opinions and maritime disputes. But at the same time, I don't think coercion decisions are entirely driven by domestic nationalistic kind of impulses for several reasons. And the first one is that if we argue that there is sort of a nationalistic and sentiment driving China's coercion decisions in the South China Sea, we will not necessarily see a divergence between more coercion on the Philippines and less coercion on the Malaysians, because I don't think there's a distinct anti-Philippines nationalism in China, right? So if you think nationalism drives Chinese coercion in the South China Sea, we might see a relatively stable frequency of coercion in with regard to these different countries of disputes in the South China Sea, not so much of a drastic difference between the Malaysians and the Philippines. Second is that I think if nationalism drives coercion decisions, we might see more or less of like a stable occurrences of coercion over time, not so much of this like cyclical coercion in the 1990s, no coercion, and then non-military coercion post 2007 in the temporal sense. And if anything, some of my at least some of my sources would suggest that if the Chinese public drives coercion decisions, we might be seeing more military coercion in the South China Sea. So in the post-2007 period, some Chinese netizens actually criticized the Chinese government for being too soft on disputes in the South China Sea, right? Because China mainly uses non-military coercion to avoid escalation, but they're criticized. The Chinese government was criticized by the Chinese citizens for being too soft on the Philippines. So that's why I don't think nationalism was the driving factor of China's coercion calculus. And as for other kinds of domestic factors, say the leaders, individual leaders, I think overall the trend of China's coercion patterns in the past 3 decades suggests that there isn't that much of a difference even after Xi Jinping comes into power. So I don't, and especially since if we expect Xi Jinping to have a asymmetrical kind of influence on coercion patterns, we might be seeing assertive leaders to use military coercion more. But instead, I think in the 1990s, China, in terms of proportion, China actually used military coercion a lot more, right, than compared to the current period. So individual leaders, I think it's important, but I don't think it's like the driving factor of China's coercion. And finally, very briefly, some might argue that since we're talking about domestic factors, the role of bureaucracies, those mid-ranking, I guess, rank and file officials, and what are their roles in China's coercion, by and large. And here we're talking about coercion decisions, not the implementation of coercion. I would say coercion decisions are very much centralized at the central decision-making level. And there are internal documents that I gathered from the PLA, Navy, and the Chinese State Oceanic Administration, which used to control the Coast Guards and the maritime surveillance ships. And there were very clearly defined modules and plans about how Chinese Coast Guard ships were supposed to behave when it comes to encountering like a foreign vessel. And every sort of such encounter will need to be reported one level up all the way to the central government. So the Scarborough Shoal incident of 2012, for example, was elevated all the way to the Politburo Standing Committee, which then had, I think, 2 rounds of meetings and then made decisions about when and whether and how to take coercive actions. There was one outlier And I happened to interview the person who was involved in that. So that was a captain at the local level of the Chinese Coast Guard, and acted basically without any authorization from the central Chinese government in one instance in maritime disputes. And the end result of him was that he was forced to resign from his post. So in a way, we're seeing the central government using a domestic killing the chicken to scare the monkey kind of dynamic to ensure that all mid-ranking, officials and bureaucracies sort of follow suit, right, with regard to coercion decisions. But one thing to note at the end is that I think it's one thing to talk about coercion decisions, which tends to be centralized more so at the central government level. But at the same time, if we're talking about implementation of coercive decisions and the level of success, there's a lot more variation where local actors, bureaucracies have a lot of leeway. So Dr. Audrey Wan, who was the presenter earlier 2 weeks ago, had a lot of just work that focuses on how local officials, local bureaucracies might have an impact on the success of Chinese economic statecraft. And similarly, Dr. Casey Mimura at the University of San Diego has written a really interesting article about under what circumstances local Chinese economic actors as well as officials can actually, I guess, defy the sanctions decisions made by the central government if they have a lot of economic interest in continuously trading with the target state.
Wonderful, thank you. Really rich answer. I think that would satisfy a dissertation defense committee, I think. I think you also addressed a little bit of CW's question here about whether you're dividing coercion by decades or administrations. I think your book is actually structured around particular dyadic sort of topics, right? So it's not either, my understanding, it's not either by decade or by administration. And you spoke a little bit, I think, to whether C is sort of the changing factor. I did have a question sort of related on this, which is choices of what made it into the book and what is not. And one that I think about a lot is the THAAD case, right, that Audrey also writes about. So South Korea, and that's one where the economic relations are actually really strong. But then they coerced, I would say unsuccessfully, right? But they chose to engage in economic coercion. So do you have any thoughts really quick on that case? And then I think one time for one last question about sort of the research, your research access. Yeah.
Sure. So I have some thoughts on that. I mean, that's a very valid point. So the THAAD case, I think didn't make it into the main sort of chapters, mainly because I was focusing, I guess, on the issues that are most important to China. So I guess according to the interest hierarchy, Taiwan, Tibet, and territorial disputes, those all together are part of China's concerns for territorial integrity, but they, in and of themselves, those rocks are not China's core interests. But like human rights issues, like for example, the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Liu Xiaobo, or the THAAD cases, I think are cases that I discuss a little bit more so in the concluding section, just because they're they're of, I guess, the third category in terms of importance to the Chinese government, and I think by and large it sort of still can be or applies to the cost balancing theory. So on the one hand, I think that the THAAD case really is a case of killing the chicken to scare the monkey, not necessarily say Japan per se, but more so to deter South Korea from maybe inviting another battery of THAAD in the future. And as for economic relations, I mean, I agree that South Korea is still very important to China, as similar to what Japan is. But at the same time, I think the long-term trend over the past 30 years is that trade between China and South Korea and trade between China and Japan, they tend to be more balanced than in the 1990s. So I guess we could argue that the economic cost, it's still there. It's just less pronounced than compared to the 1990s. Because there are cases in the 1990s where China refrained from coercion against Japan over similar issues, but because of acute concerns about economic costs. So I think by and large, it still applies to the theory in the book.
Great, thank you. And I think we're going to conclude with one last question, which is actually the first question that came in about whether, these are increasingly sensitive topics, right? And somebody was wondering whether you're allowed to travel freely to China and Hong Kong, I guess, for research for this book and also subsequent to its publication. What do you think is happening there?
That
And then
that
we'll
is
wrap
a
with.
that's a very good question. And I guess I am traveling to China in the summer, so we'll test, hopefully you all see me back at some point. And if not, I guess that is an answer to what you just asked. So most of my research though on this book were done well before the pandemic, where access was increasingly narrower than compared to I think the early 2000s were the golden years, but you can still have access to like certain people. I think my understanding, talking to some of the Chinese scholars who have traveled more recently here in the U.S., especially San Francisco, for conferences, etc., is that at least in the scholarly community, there isn't that much of a, there's less political correctness. Their point is that you're fine if you go visit or give talks in like Chinese universities. But of course, it does mean that I need to be a little bit more, I guess, cautious myself. When traveling to China, I don't think that in subsequent research I can get the same level of access that I did, say 7 years ago. There are a lot of people that I interviewed that I don't think I will interview just because of, I think, safety concerns, but also for their safety too. But my more recent research has evolved a little bit more, so maybe closer to Dr. Jack Zhang's realm, which tends to be less directly or sensitive. So it's not about coercion per se. So I'm more interested in brand strategy more recently. So I guess that might potentially reduce the sensitivity of some of the research. But of course, again, I'll put it to test when I visit China in the summer.
And the realm of what's sensitive is growing wider and wider, sadly. But unfortunately, this is all the time we have. Thank you so much for a really rich and informative talk. And congratulations again on the book. I'm going to turn over things to Jason Connolly, representing the U.S. Heartland China Association shortly. But as you see in the chat, this is an event that's flagship event of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and they have a national live stream speaker as well, Dr. Campbell, and that recording is going to be on YouTube. So the video link is there in the chat for those who are interested. But over to Jason for the last word. Thank you again, Ketian.
Okay, well, thank you, Jack. And again, thank you to Ketian for such a wonderful overview of your book. As someone who personally studied the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese economic power geopolitically in their graduate degree, I'm personally very motivated by your book and your work. Very inspiring. I think that listening to the two of you talk about Chinese strength and political power in a geographical sense is an important topic. Has become increasingly important in the past few years. And I think as we look forward to the remainder of 2024, will continue to be very important. So I'll be curious to see if Deputy Secretary Campbell mentions that in his remarks tonight as we move into that. I just did want to introduce my organization really briefly and thank the International Relations Council as well as the University of Kansas for making this event possible. I work for the U.S. Heartland China Association. Or a 501c3 nonprofit. These themes of Chinese strength, geopolitical ties are questions that we answer every day in our work. We focus more on the Heartland region, which I imagine for a lot of our audience here working with IRC, University of Kansas, that would appeal to you. So we focus on the Heartland region as opposed to our coasts and navigating this U.S.-China relationship and exploring how we work better in the Midwest and the Heartland to improve our relationship with China. One way that we do that is through agriculture and agricultural business. So we will be taking a major delegation to China this June, which we're very excited about. So if anyone in our audience does work in agriculture or is interested in learning more, just check out our website. Feel free to shoot me a message. But again, I'm looking forward to the next hour of our program, where we'll hear a little bit more about Chinese strength, Chinese political power, and more from a national level, how the US views those things. So thank you so much to our audience again, and Ketian for a wonderful overview, and Jack for being such a great moderator.
Wonderful. That's a wrap. Thank you so much, Jason, Evan, Ketian. Great event. Please, thank you to the audience members, and do look out for these future events coming up, and for the recording of this talk in the YouTube channel, the Center for East Asian Studies at KU. All right, thank you. Take care. Again, the link to the national broadcast we just put into the chat here. So do join us also for watching Dr. Kirk Campbell's national address. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Jack.
Orleans, president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to welcome audiences from over 70 venues throughout the United States, Canada, and China to our 18th annual China Town Hall. Each year, we convene China Town Hall because we believe in the importance of educating the public about all that is happening in the U.S.-China relationship. This past year, in fact, exactly 12 months, has been pivotal for bilateral ties, culminating in President Biden and President Xi meeting in San Francisco. Since then, we've seen progress on a number of issues, including bilateral communication and fentanyl control. And just last week, we saw Secretary Yellen travel to Beijing to meet with senior Chinese leaders. Yet deep differences still divide our two countries. Can the countries capitalize on this cooperative period, or will we return to a period of tense ties? We're thrilled to have the Deputy Secretary of State, Dr. Kurt Campbell, with us here tonight to discuss the current state of U.S.-China relations and answer your questions. Prior to assuming his current position, Deputy Secretary Campbell served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the National Security Council. During his distinguished career, he's also served in senior positions at the State Department, Defense Department, Treasury, and NSC. Full disclosure, he served as a director of the National Committee from 2013 to 2020. And also full disclosure, I'm proud to call him a friend. To participate in the conversation tonight on Twitter, use the hashtag CTH2024. You can also scan the QR code on the bottom of your screen to take a poll and share your thoughts on U.S.-China relations. Let me begin with a few of my own questions for Deputy Secretary Campbell. Kurt, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. I was just noting this is your second appearance on China Town Hall, and it's only our 18th time. But can
I just say, please call me Kurt, if you would, Steve.
It's tough to call you Deputy Secretary.
It's tough even for me, actually. So,
tell us where we are in U.S.-China relations, where we've come from, and where we're going, and what happens assuming President Biden is reelected.
So let me, if I could, first of all, it's an honor to be with you, Steve, and I welcome everyone from many places around the United States who have an interest and are focused on where U.S.-China relations are going. And I welcome you all, and thanks for the opportunity. I want to say a word just quickly about Steve. If we are able to manage our way through a very challenging time, I acknowledge that, and I live it. It will largely be due to key people who are passionate and committed and determined to find common ground. I know of no person who has dedicated more of their life to finding that common ground than you, Stephen. We have not always agreed, but the truth is I've learned an enormous amount from you, and I appreciate the opportunity to give and take. So look, I would say this. Um, I think when President Biden came into power, I think there was a sense that China was testing us and was proceeding under the belief that the United States was in some sort of hurtling decline, and that they believed that they could press us in key ways, take advantage of certain opportunities in technology and security and the like. And I think what President Biden and his team has sought to do is put in place a consequential set of steps. First, beginning with investment in the key areas of national strength, which increasingly, Steve, as you know, will be in technology. Issues like semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, robotics, and recognizing that this is the high ground for national power and strategic competition. Secondly, working closely with allies and partners to build a consensus around maintaining the global operating system, which we believe has been so beneficial, particularly the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the last 60 or 70 years, I would argue that they've been the best with respect to lifting people out of poverty, huge amount of innovation. And I think the U.S. commitment to peace and stability has been a large part of that. And then I think building on those foundational pieces has been a substantial bilateral commitment to finding common ground, but also being clear-headed about engagement with China. And so what we've seen is a series of engagements, probably the most effective, as you indicate, Steve, was in San Francisco, in which the two leaders underscored that, yes, there are elements of competition in our relationship. We want to keep those elements healthy. We want to keep that competition from veering into confrontation or conflict. We believe that the way to do that is to keep lines of communication open and the ability to be able to engage when there's misunderstandings or potentials for accidents, but then at the same time find those areas where it will be essential to maintain communication and working together. I note, Steve, that you were in Beijing just the last couple of weeks with the most distinguished delegation of business and financial leaders, trying to figure out what's going on in China right now and what is the nature of our economic relationship. But we underscore fundamentally the need to work on existential questions like climate change. We think the people to people dimension, which has animated so much of our relationship in the hopes of people on both sides, seeking steps to increase trade, travel, those things are practical steps that we need to take. But at the same time, I know this is a long answer, we are having to deal with challenging issues like China's support for Russia in the Ukraine war. Obviously, we're trying to manage carefully and engage on issues where we have differences of view. And I think ultimately the visit of Secretary Yellen, the call between President Biden and President Xi that preceded that, the upcoming visit of Secretary Blinken, these are all indications that both sides, I think for now, are determined to keep U.S. China relations on a steady, stable path.
Has a date been set for Secretary Blinken going?
I think it probably has, but I don't think I'm supposed to announce it. But it's, and I'm learning all these things now in this new role. But it will be coming up soon. And look, we think this will be a major visit. I think we want to display other elements of the relationship in terms of education, business, and we expect him to see the senior leaders as well.
You mentioned my visit a couple of weeks ago and where we had the opportunity with some business leaders to meet with President Xi. One of the issues he raised, and one which I've actually raised, is kind of the over-securitization of U.S. China relations. You know, we've seen cranes, chips, EVs, batteries fall within now a definition of national security. What's going on there and what should we do? He's concerned that ultimately when you, and he implicitly recognized the Chinese do this too.
Yeah.
So can the two sides engage in a discussion of what is national security, get a definition?
Well, look, it's going to be important to have those discussions, Steve. I would simply say that the larger context here is important. Last year was an absolute banner year in trade. There's substantial investment flowing in both directions. Lots of Chinese goods come to the United States, lots of opportunities. Um, yes, we do hear from Chinese interlocutors occasionally about, gee, you're targeting our social media companies. I would just simply say that our social media companies are not allowed to
Right.
engage in China. So there is an unequal playing field to begin with. And so, look, I think what's important on our part is to explain clearly what it means to have high walls or high fences and small yard, to make sure that only the most careful things that require scrutiny are observed with respect to potential um, uh, controls or uh, areas that we would prevent certain kinds of engagement with China. And much of those efforts tend to be in technology areas, AI chips and the like. And I think ultimately our focus in technology are in dual use capabilities that potentially could have security uses that are antithetical to our interests. And I think we've been clear about that with our Chinese interlocutors. I will also say that if you listen carefully, what Secretary Yellen indicated on her recent trip is that we're also concerned by the potential of China seeking to use their overcapacity to flood American and other global markets. And she's warned, I think appropriately, and she has worked assiduously to build stronger ties between the United States and China, but she's warned her economic and treasury ministry of finance counterparts that if those steps are taken, we will not sit by idly. And what happened 10 years ago on steel with Chinese products basically squashing American competition, we won't and cannot sit by idly to let that happen. And so I do think we've sought to explain clearly what our issues are. And I also believe that those conversations are helpful and they are ongoing, Steve. So this is not a dialogue of the deaf. It's a deaf. It is not a situation in which we're not interacting regularly. We are, and we are explaining clearly and unambiguously what our concerns are.
Can we negotiate white lists, things which are basically going to telling businesses it's okay, both in terms of goods and investment?
So look, I think we've sought in private conversations with businesses to basically give indicators where there are warning signals, and we've also indicated areas that we think are unexceptional more generally. I think today there's much greater clarity in the business community about what's acceptable and what is not. But I will also say, Steve, if I can, I think the limiting factor is not the US government response. I think you were there with the business community. The truth is, there's some real challenges currently to operating in China. I know Chinese friends, interlocutors are trying to deal with that, but they have a long way to go. The business environment is not nearly as welcoming as it was 15 or 20 years ago. And I think being honest with Chinese interlocutors about that is important. It's, oftentimes, we'll listen to Chinese interlocutors and they'll say, look, we're opening up and we're following reform. But then if you really chase that down and ask for specifics, they're not as forthcoming.
Yeah, we certainly raised those issues with President Xi, the concern about the Chinese economy, concern about the investment environment, and he responded, that reform and opening has been the foundation for China's success, and will go in that direction. We'll continue to go in that direction. Of course, the business community says, well, the proof is going to be in the pudding. Yeah. We got to, exactly what you're saying. We have to see how things are.
Just on that, Steve, I will say this. Look, I don't envy the current generation of financial diplomats in China. The challenges are enormous. but they're also following in the wake of literally the most effective global diplomats, financial engineers of modern times. Wang Qishan, Liu He, these people were incredibly effective at managing the opening to the West and trying to preserve certain advantages. I think some of the current team have a lot to prove, and I think there's pressure on them to try to be able to take the necessary steps to deal with youth unemployment, property challenges, issues about domestic demand, global confidence generally in among Chinese firms. These are all things that, frankly, are unrelated to the United States that China will have to deal with.
We want to go to our first audience question, which is going to be from Isabel Mashlab at Northwestern University's Town Hall. Isabel, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Isabel Mashlab. I'm a junior from Iowa City, Iowa, and I'm studying international studies and political science. Thank you so much for having me. My question is, President Xi Jinping said to President Biden last week on their phone call that China is not trying to outcompete the United States. Do you believe this to be true? How would you describe the current U.S. China relationship?
Before you answer that question, thank you. It's a great question. We're trying something new this year, which is we're polling our audience on what they think China is, one word, and we have competitor, partner, frenemy, or enemy. And obviously competitor looks like it's 57%, frenemy 30%, enemy only 6%, and partner 7%. So that's kind of, obviously this is a very unscientific sample,
but it's a sophisticated sample, and I appreciate the question very much. Thank you for that. Look, my sense is that China is a serious country. I think they seek advantage where they can find it. And yes, I think they are fierce, intense competitors, as is the United States. I think competition is what has driven the United States forward. It is what animates China's purpose, both domestically and the global stage. And so I don't think we should in any way discourage fierce competition. I think the key is to make sure that that competition is fair, that it is transparent, and that it doesn't veer into conflict or instability. And I think that's our goal as we go forward. But I do believe that China is competing to win without question.
Yeah. Let's go to our next question to Tulane University Town Hall. Gabriella.
Hello, Deputy Secretary Campbell. My name's Gabriella Preziosi, and I go to Tulane University. Thank you so much for having me. My question is, given the complexities of the United States-China relationship, what are the key areas you believe the United States can and should seek engagement with China, and how would you prioritize these areas?
We also polled the audience, this coincidence, we also polled the audience on this. So let's see what the results of that were. In other words, where are the areas that the audience thought we could cooperate? And it looks like there's a glare.
Trade and investment, illicit drugs looks substantial there. I can't tell if that's, looks like it's a 9 or 9%. I'm hard to tell exactly, but
people to people looks like it's 34%. International conflict resolution, which I take it refers to the Mideast and Ukraine, 22%. Technology, 19%. Climate, 28%. Illicit drugs, 30-something%, and trade and investment, 27%. But where do you think we could cooperate?
These are all, this is a great list. I just want to commend you on this format, Steve. It's wonderful to link all these people together, and it's great to see students so engaged. And I commend you on that, the important role of thinking about the world and asking these hard questions. Look, these are all critical issues. At my core, I believe that the essential fundamental responsibility of the United States and China is to take climate seriously as an existential issue. I really commend the work, the passionate work that Secretary Kerry, as our climate envoy, undertook. Really without any pause and tremendous intensity over the course of the last 3 years. But I will also say I think the United States has been ambitious in a number of areas. We're going to need to see more from China, and I think given their slowdown, some of their more ambitious climate goals have fallen by the wayside. I think we're at a situation now where China's emissions are over 50% of global emissions and rising. They've made a big deal about not financing coal plants externally, but have continued them domestically. These are areas that we've got to be clear about. And I think, we tend to just be grateful when Chinese interlocutors come to various international climate fora. We need to see more progress there. I think the United States has taken very challenging steps. Our issues are going to be follow through more than anything else. For China, it is to make the kind of commitments and follow through on them domestically more than anything else. I think people to people issues are important, educational opportunities. I do think there are areas where the United States and China can work together. When I was Assistant Secretary here in the past, we worked quietly on issues that were challenging on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea. We also worked, Steve, on Burma. Mm-hmm. I think there are areas where our interests overlap, and we can perhaps not necessarily cooperate, but align and make sure that we are in close consultation and communication. Ultimately, what we have to be about is building habits of cooperation. And in truth, despite the remarkable engagement between our two sides, the sense of entanglement economically and commercially, we have not built the habits of necessary cooperation that will be essential if the U.S.-China relationship is to flourish into the future.
How destructive is China's relationship with Russia in terms of building these habits of cooperation? So this morning, as you know, I watch the Chinese news every morning.
Yeah.
And this morning I awakened to Xi Jinping sitting at the head of the table with Lavrov sitting on his left and Wang Yi sitting on his right on a rectangular table. And I said, boy, it was the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and China. But it's pretty destructive.
Yeah. So look, guys, I will tell you that, Steve has helped me and tutored me and lectured me. The one area that we disagreed at the outset, that I'm going to say on air that I think I was right about, was the relationship between China and Russia, which I think
disagree with.
Well, you did a little.
I tell you what the other position is.
We fought about it, but let me tell you what I think. What we're facing, friends. Look, we often hear from Chinese interlocutors like this is a red line, this is a core interest, and we have to trespass very carefully on areas that are so important to their sense of national identity and purpose. For the United States, the awakening globally, our most important mission historically has been the maintenance of peace and stability in Europe, right? And I will say, and Steve knows this, we warned our Chinese interlocutors in advance of the invasion.
Yes.
I'm not sure they completely believed us or thought that maybe it would be a smaller thing, not an all-out move and push. I think the Chinese leadership were surprised at the enormity of the initial actions and then were alarmed by Putin being on the defensive almost immediately. From that stage early in the conflict, I think Chinese interlocutors have made a decision to provide the necessary wherewithal in terms of machine tools, joint use capabilities, a whole variety of capacities, Steve, to basically allow Russia to retool. Now, I think initially that was a defensive endeavor. They did not want to see regime change. They didn't want to see Putin fall. Let's remember that the relationship that she has invested the most with globally is not a Western leader, but President Putin. They've met dozens of times, up to 50 times, hundreds of hours. They've endeavored to build a partnership that's largely based on agreement with the West and the United States. But we're in a different situation now. So Russia is almost completely retooled, and they now pose a significant threat going forward to Ukraine, but to the surrounding region. And see, the point that we're trying to make to Chinese interlocutors is that this is our strategic interest. This is the most central issue, and China is involving themselves in a way that they think that we don't completely understand. We do understand what's going on. This is a substantial effort. We're making clear to European partners the risks of this, and we have told China directly, if this continues, it will have an impact on the U.S. China relationship. We will not sit by and say everything is fine. For instance, if Russia's offenses continue and they gain territory in Ukraine, that will alter the balance of power in Europe in ways that are, frankly, unacceptable from our perspective. And we will see this not as just a Russian unique set of activities, but a conjoined set of activities backed by China, but also North Korea. This is antithetical to our interests. And we've been clear and transparent with them about this.
It was so interesting. In the meeting with President Xi, he was talking about economic resilience of China. So he's sending a message, the economy, we are resilient. We're going to make our 5.2%. It's the new model. We could do 10, but that would be qualitatively not good growth. Then he said something, he says, we're resilient. Look at our history. Then he said in 1956, the Soviet Union withdrew its machinery from the northeastern China. And I kind of went, wow, he knows this history.
2 years later, they detonated a nuclear weapon. And
China did. But China showed but that he used that as an example was kind of, to me, quite interesting.
Well, Steve, I'm not sure you remember this, but we were talking after the Bali summit, and I mentioned to you that President Xi used that very same historical experience. And I think occasionally what he will say to Western interlocutors is that no matter what you do, you try to withhold capabilities, we're going to persevere and we'll overcome obstacles. Look, I don't think that relates directly with Ukraine. I would simply say that I do not believe what China is doing here is in the interests of Europe, the United States. But I will also say I don't believe that China fundamentally wants to see at this juncture the borders of Europe fundamentally rewritten through conflict. I don't think that is in their strategic interests.
On something we disagreed about slightly, but then we came to agreement, which is official contact between U.S. government officials and Chinese government officials. How is it today, and how's your relationship in terms of communications with your counterpart?
Look, Steve, at the time, one of the things that Steve would ask me about, he said, look, you've got to meet more, you've got to engage more the Chinese ambassador. I will tell you now, it can be told, I was meeting with him regularly. It was really other meetings. He really wanted higher level engagement. This is our former ambassador, Gong. And Steve was very good at trying to build those bridges. At the time, I think Steve was the first to note that at that time, Gong's potential trajectory would have made him one of the most powerful officials in the conduct of Chinese foreign ministry, basically of the last 30 or 40 years. He had that potential ahead of him. Now, we still don't really know exactly what happened. This is a topic that you cannot discuss with Chinese interlocutors. If you brought his name up, there would be an immediate silence and there would be no discussion of him. But the truth is that Steve's encouragement to me and others, we engaged with them intensively, was very helpful in terms of passing messages at points of tension in cross-strait relations. We are actively engaged with all our counterparts. I've had a recent call with the executive vice minister. We see the ambassador regularly. I think we are now back to a situation in which the lines of communication are almost fully open. What we're still seeking, Steve, is more engagement on the military and operational side. And I think the Chinese system is ready to take those steps, and we're ready to meet them halfway in keeping those lines of communications open.
Where it's in the afternoon, let's go to the University of Hawaii, to Brent White to ask his question.
Good afternoon, Brent White, Chief Global Officer at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our question is there any possibility that the Level 3 travel advisory to China will be lifted or reduced in the near future? It serves as a disincentive to resuming student and scholarly exchanges, which both the United States and China have expressed a desire to increase.
Look, thank you, Brett, for the question, and welcome and aloha to all our friends out in Hawaii. I had a good opportunity. I was on the board of the East-West Center, and I had a chance to work with your institution extensively. Thank you for the work that you are doing. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I would just simply say that this is certainly an issue under active consideration, and I accept your premise that these travel advisories have served as an inhibition to the kinds of rebuilding the kinds of people-to-people and other academic exchanges that we've seen in the past. So I would just simply say under active consideration.
The a follow-up question actually from Pin Ni from Wanxiang America and Dennis Simon from ICAS both ask, you know, President Xi at the dinner you were at talked about 50,000 American students over the next 5 years going to China. What's your view of that initiative? And is there a U.S. strategy? I mean, I assume we think this is good to have Americans study in China, speak Chinese, and kind of understand their culture better and come back and work in the State Department is a good thing.
Steve, I would simply say I first met you when well, not my first, but my first really active engagement with you was part of an initiative that I did in the previous Obama administration called 100,000 Strong,
right,
in which I tried to take active steps, actually work to build a foundation that would actively promote American students studying in China. And we reached that goal of 100,000 over a couple of years, and we were proud of that. Now, a host of things have taken place, COVID, other challenges and restrictions, some on our side, some on the Chinese side. I do not believe the environment is as hospitable for educational exchange as it was in the past. And I think both sides are going to need to take steps. It's not just the United States. But we're in a situation now today, Steve, where the number of Chinese students is on the upswing from China to the United States. And the number of American students studying in China has plummeted absolutely. And that's plummeted for a variety of reasons. And it's not only that Americans are looking at other places and some choosing to stay home, but I think they do have some concerns about studying in China currently, and there are concerns about academic freedom and the like. Nevertheless, some degree of academic exchange is very much in our interests, and I support that, and I support steps to increase those opportunities and exchanges as we go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important. Is the department, I know the department has an initiative to get more Chinese speakers in the lower levels of the
Absolutely.
Is it succeeding?
Look, I think the truth is, Steve, we're trying to build capacity across the department in capacities associated with the Indo-Pacific. At the core of that is an understanding both in language, history, culture of China. And I think I think we're coming along, but Steve, these are not initiatives that can bear full fruit overnight. It takes a long time. Capacity building is one of the hardest things in the U.S. government. And so ask me in a few years.
Yeah. I can ask you something today, though, which is, and I'm always amazed, it's like fake news. If you live in China, can you get a security clearance to join the Department of State?
If you've lived in China?
Yes.
A large number of the people that I work with have lived in China and have spent time in China. So the person.
The answer is yes, of course.
Yes, of course.
People tell me, no, you can't. I go, that's not
Every
true.
single person, Steve, that you talk to in the White House and the State Department has lived in China, not just as diplomats, but as students and changing or traveling around. So no, that is not the case.
What are our allies saying about our China policy? Are you getting support, dissent?
I think we're in a better place now than we were a few months ago. I think there were, look, uh, Asia's complicated. They have a little bit of the Goldilocks. You know, they don't like it when it's too hot, but they don't like it when U.S. China are building what they view as a G2 over their heads. They want uh, prudent, careful diplomacy. They want their interests preserved and their circumstances not dealt with above their heads. I think it would be fair to say that we are in close consultations with allies and partners about our relationship with China. I think more than anything else, Steve, they appreciate we're talking to them more about U.S. China relations. I think in the past, sometimes we did not share as much. We're much more open about what our goals are, what our objectives are. I still think there are some countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, that worry that in a competitive world they feel like they have to make choices and that they're somehow betwixt and between, and they don't seek that. They like the attention and the ability to leverage resources, but they don't want to be a pawn in a larger global competition. And we hear some of that more generally. I think there is general satisfaction about the state of U.S. China relations. I will say two different things, though. They are worried about the economic trajectory in China. They are not as optimistic about your growth numbers as
That's not my growth
yeah,
numbers.
or
It's
the
the
ones in the
Chinese
Chinese.
growth numbers.
And they worry about the United States as well. And so it's not just that they worry about the state of the relationship, but they worry about the domestic trajectory of both of our countries.
You've spent a lot of time with the Japanese Prime Minister this week,
Yes.
who's now in DC. Japan pretty much on the same page as we are.
I think that's the case, yes. In fact, we've talked to our Chinese interlocutors about this relationship. China, I think, has complex views, as you know, Steve, of Japan, but the U.S.-Japan relationship is our most important foundational relationship in Asia. It has grown in importance. It's no longer regional, it's global. They're with us in Ukraine, in Haiti, supporting us in Gaza, in the Pacific. I think Prime Minister Kishida is a rare leader. We've been able to really take the U.S.-Japan relationship to the next level, and it will be on full display over the course of this week. And we will also have a trilateral meeting later in this week between the United States, Japan, and the Philippines for the first time, and President Marcos will join us.
Let's go to a question from University of California, San Diego. Gary Zhu. We're not hearing you.
You're gonna have to try again, Gary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gary, a PhD candidate in political science at UC San Diego. It is great honor to ask Mr. Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell, who is also a distinguished alumni of UCSD, a question. So my question is, how do you evaluate the possibility of a military conflict between the mainland China and Taiwan over the next decade? And given your evaluation, what do you think the United States will play a role in the future game? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I want to acknowledge how important the question is, but I do want to just say a word or two. I am not a particularly distinguished graduate of UC San Diego, although I'm very fond of my time there. I do want to say that the premier meeting and conference every year that is held to basically explore with the best experts in the world where China is going, where the U.S. China relationship is going, is hosted by UCSD. I think I saw Lei and other friends at UCSD in the audience there, and I want to say hello to them, and we look forward to that meeting in August in La Jolla, following on the meeting that was held this winter here in Washington, D.C., in which National Security Advisor Sullivan gave a key speech about the current trajectory in U.S. China relations. But what I was going to say is my first introduction to China was a class taught by Susan Shirk. I was a young student. She chastised me. I came to class all wet. I had literally gotten off my surfboard. I brought it into class and my wetsuit was dripping wet. And she said, you know, you've got to get yourself in order. You can't be so disrespectful, and you can't track sand and water into my classroom. I think from that point on, I became a little bit more serious of a student. And so grateful to call her a lifelong colleague and friend. Look, the most important thing that we can do is carefully to signal responsibly our determination to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And that involves a variety of things, both communications, deployments, clear messaging. I would simply note one of the most important elements of the U.S. strategy in the recent period. In the past, it was often only the United States speaking alone about the absolute need to preserve peace and stability, to sustain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, a status quo that we think has served the interests of the peoples on both sides of the strait. Increasingly larger numbers of international actors have spoken out as well about their desire to maintain peace and stability, to make sure lines of communication are open, and to build a degree of trust and confidence. We do see actions on the part of the PRC that are concerning, increasing military activities, deployments that concern us. But at the same time, we persevere in our determination to underscore our critical role as a key guarantor, as outlined in the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, of that maintenance of peace and stability, which we think has been a tremendous achievement that has propelled the region to greater heights. When we talk about the advances in technology, what TSMC has done is remarkable. We're grateful for the partnership that we have, unofficial partnership with Taiwan on so many different things. Ultimately, it is our professed goal to do what's necessary to preserve that peace and stability that has been so critical to the progress we've seen to date.
Let's talk a bit about kind of the ancillary effects. Tremendous effect, actually, of our China policy, especially, I would say, the last administration. We've seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So let our next question go to the New England Chinese American Alliance Town Hall, joining us from Newton City Hall in Massachusetts. Hua Wang, over to you.
Hello, good evening. So this is Hua Wang, co-chair of New England Chinese American Alliance. So thank you for inviting us to participate in this important conversation. As a community organization, we're concerned about the increasing suspicion of the loyalty and integrity of Chinese Americans, such as the China Initiative. Such suspicions not only hurt the racial minority, we all know about the Japanese American internment, but also tear apart the fabric of American society, such as during the McCarthy era. So how to protect the equal rights of the Chinese Americans and avoid stereotyping Chinese culture and people while managing the complex U.S.-China relations? Thank you.
Well, so look, I appreciate the question, and I believe that this is a very serious matter. I will simply say that President Biden, Steve, has spoken out on this. He has rejected this kind of stereotyping. He has condemned the attacks on Asian Americans that affect not just Chinese Americans, but across a broad range of groups here in the United States. He's condemned that publicly, repeatedly, and in the company of prominent Asian Americans. He's appointed for the first time a wonderful person in his administration in the White House, Erica Martsugi, who represents Asian and island communities in all things in the White House. She has been tireless in her commitment to ensuring that we are taking every possible step to prevent this kind of blacklisting and questions about the patriotism of honorable Americans. And so I think those are critical efforts underway, and we have to be able to distinguish between perhaps steps or activities, third column things that China has done in the United States, and also the activities of of Americans. And I just think this is a hard issue, and I think over time we are, I think, handling this issue with greater care and understanding than perhaps it was done 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. We're seeing a large influx of Chinese migrants coming to the United States, kind of leaving China, going sometimes through the Mideast, coming to Mexico and entering the United States.
It has not gotten enough attention, but it is a remarkable thing. The number of Chinese economic migrants that have come to the United States over the course of the last, several months, number in the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. It is a remarkable thing. And I would just underscore that these are people, many of the people that are coming up the corridor in Latin America are absolutely impoverished with very little to call their own. Many of the Chinese migrants that are coming have had to spend an enormous amount of money to get the airline tickets, to get down to join these groups that come up to the United States. So it is a remarkable thing that we're seeing. It is a subject of some conversation. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese government is aware of it, probably a little concerned by it. But I don't think they've taken steps at this juncture to curtail it either.
These migrants seem to blend into the Chinese community in the United States rather than being in the, taken care of by municipal or state governments. Is my impression correct?
Steve, I think that's anecdotal, but I think generally the case, yes. And but the truth is the numbers that we're seeing are large and frankly of gathering concern.
I think if I don't end this, your staff is probably going to have me lynched. But this has been just a tour de force. This is remarkable.
It's my pleasure, Steve. You're the host here. It's been my honor and my pleasure. I hope to do this again. Can I just say to the people that have listened, I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate your interest. And Steve, we don't always agree, but you are my friend, and I appreciate the passion that you bring to this endeavor, this complex endeavor of charting a course for the
I value our friendship, and I think you're really one of America's great public servants. It's remarkable. But let me just use 30 seconds to thank our speakers and partners across the United States and China for hosting this event. Thanks to the Star Foundation for its continued generosity in funding China Town Hall. And finally, thank you to the National Committee staff for the hard work in coordinating this nationwide, I should say, this worldwide event. Thank you all.
Can I also thank my team here at the State Department? We are in the State Department today. They've labored to put this together. I'm very grateful to our technical teams and all the people that have made this possible. Steve, thank you to you and your team. Be well, everyone.
Kurt, thank you.